G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. With what they call the NOTAM, forgive the ancient old-fashioned language, notice to airmen, regarding air tractors, auxiliary ventral fins and firefighting operations. So that means I'm wearing my aeroplanologist's hat, okay? And I'm sure you understand that normally a NOTAM comes from the top down. It's delivered from qualified authorities, whereas in this case it's a kind of grassroots level NOTAM, because I do not personally feel that I can afford to wait the length of time it'll take for officialdom to pay attention to my observations and analysis and conclusions. Therefore, I'm going to post it on YouTube before I go and talk to anybody else. Now, for those of you who are not particularly familiar with aircraft design, an auxiliary fin is something that a designer sticks onto an airframe after it has been discovered that they did not make the main fin big enough. This results in the aircraft being directionally unstable and snaking backwards and forwards. Now in this case, on a thing called a fairy gannet, it's got a twin Mamba engine, which is basically two turbo shaft engines driving a coaxial gearbox, so it's got two propellers, one in front of the other, and the propellers go in different directions. And it was discovered that the not inconsiderable side area of the propellers was so far in front of the aerodynamic centre of pressure of the wing that the original tail just wasn't enough, and the aeroplane was directionally unstable, so auxiliary fins were fitted. And I ask you to note that 2/3 of the surface area of the auxiliary fin is above the level of the horizontal stabiliser, particularly, specifically, precisely in order to keep most of the fin out of the potential impact zone of any stones kicked up by the main wheels of the undercarriage if operating on a dirt or a gravel strip. However, as sensible as it is from an aerodynamic and an operations point of view, from a marketing point of view, it makes it clearly obvious that the designer has been in error when originally laying out the dimensions of the tail fin. And not many designers like to make the ventral fin or the auxiliary fins as obvious as they are on the gannet. It's like an admission of incompetence in the original instance, you know. I didn't make the tail fin big enough, or I didn't make the fuselage long enough, therefore I have to stick extra bits onto the original design. Which brings me to the air tractor series of agricultural aircraft which are currently used in Australia to spray insecticide or other chemicals onto cotton crops and wheat crops, God knows what else. They sport auxiliary fins on the tail, but they're ventral fins. There's nothing above the level of the stabiliser. And these days the aircraft have enormously powerful turboprop engines, you know, 2,000 horsepower plus. But to be honest, your basic design for an agricultural aircraft hasn't changed a great deal since I was in short pants. Here we have a 1967 vintage aircraft, which I received for Christmas when I was maybe 7 years old, and here we have a picture of a thing they call a Snow Commander, and what the caption says: aircraft designed for agricultural work such as the Snow Commander have a raised cockpit to give the pilot a good all-round view, and wire cutters in case they fly into telephone wires or cables. Their structure is carefully designed to protect the pilot in the event of the crash. Here's the bit I want you to pay attention to. It's got a very short nose because it's got a big, old, heavy, round radial engine. And the original air tractors, they also had radial engines, and then they were modified following the success of the turbo thrush, or turbine thrush, by having turboprop engines fitted. And turboprop engines are small, lightweight, extraordinarily powerful, but they burn prodigious quantities of fuel. This meant that to get the weight and balance right, the designer had to shift the engine a lot further forward, which dramatically increased the surface area, side area, in front of the wing's centre of pressure, and this meant that apparently the early turbine air tractors suffered a little bit of directional instability. They used to snake from side to side, and therefore, thus and because, the designer has been forced to resort to auxiliary fins to increase the side area behind the centre of pressure. And because he didn't want anybody to notice, the practice has been to install ventral auxiliary fins only with nothing on top of the stabiliser. Great for marketing, not necessarily so good for operational safety. As it happens, I say this because last week I went out to an airport to work for the Rural Firefighting Service for the afternoon, pumping water into air tractors. And I happened to notice that a patch was hanging off the inside surface of the auxiliary ventral fin. You'd have to call it the medial vertical surface of the auxiliary ventral fin. And in order to see this, one has to be inside the ventral fin with respect to the fuselage. If one is outside the ventral fin, like standing at the wingtip, you can't see it. You would have to be, as I was, round about here, connecting, or keeping an eye on the water connection to the hopper, because we were firefighting. Right? Now, normally a pilot is expected to make a walk-around inspection before every takeoff. But that doesn't tend to happen in agricultural operations. It is assumed that if the aircraft landed safely, then it must be fit to fly again. So in firefighting operations, the ground crew are trained not to look at anything except the part of the operation for which they are responsible. The two people who carry the hose out to the aircraft, takes two because when you're pumping retardant the hoses are heavy enough it takes two people to drag them, they are trained only to look at the hose connection or the wingman. The wingman is trained to stand at the wing's rear edge at the tip and keep his eyes fixed on the pilot. He's not allowed to look around at anything else that might be going on, because the pilot may discover something that requires an instant shutdown of pumping. Therefore, the wingman has to look at the pilot. The connection personnel have to look at the wingman, because when you're up close, standing right here, you can't actually see what the pilot is doing in his window up there because you're too close. You would have to move at least 1.5 meters away from the hose coupling in order to be able to see what the pilot's doing. But the problem is, the wingman is not able to see what's happening on the inside of the auxiliary ventral fin. Now, because I have never done an Airbase Operators course, I wasn't aware of this protocol, that you're only allowed to look at one thing at a time. You're not allowed to look sideways at anything else, otherwise, you will have broken the regulations in the training manual. Because I didn't realise that, the very first firebomber that I was working on last week, I happened to notice that from an aeroplane designer and test pilot's point of view, and I have fulfilled both of those functions in my life, this looked seriously iffy. So I broke all of the teachings in the code book for Airbase Operations Rural Fire Service staff. I abandoned my post, standing there hanging onto the hose coupling, and I went and I had a look at the tail fin. And what I saw was more or less this. There was what turned out to be, I initially thought it was a piece of original skin, but it was not. It was a patch. The patch had been equipped with a Z piece to lock it to the other skin on the other side of the fin, and it had a stiffener, and all that had been busted off and ripped out, presumably by a stone impact. I don't know whether it happened on landing or it happened earlier on takeoff, but these things have, you know, roughly 2,000 horsepower engines, so the slipstream's pretty fierce. And my concern is that this is stone impact damage on precisely the same part of the airframe in two separate incidents. A stone has knocked a piece out of the fin, the hole has been patched, and another stone has hit the fin and knocked it out again. Now, the reason this is concerning to me is that the aluminium was tearing in the direction of the arrows, and it was pretty clear to me that this large patch, which, to be honest, was about the size of my hand, with fingers extended, it was going to get blown back past this forward tail strut, and it would be then flopping up and down in a more or less perfect position to insert itself into the hinge line of the elevator. And I may be an autodidactic aeroplanologist, but I do know that it's not safe or fair or friendly or reasonable to send anybody up into the sky in an aeroplane that's about to equip itself with a control lock while in flight under load. And so I sort of called a bit of a halt to proceedings, and I, mimed at the pilot and got him to come down and have a look. And then, because I was not aware that the pilot of the other air tractor, we had two on the field at the time, I wasn't aware the pilot of the other air tractor was actually a licensed aircraft maintenance engineer. I'm not. I'm just a sort of freelance designer and test pilot, and I have flown underneath my own pop rivets and designed and carved two propellers for the ultralight motor glider that I used to play around with before I broke it. And I figured that I would be able to secure that patch of skin so that it was not going to be able to detach. And if we could do that, we could keep having two firebombers. And at the time there were 22 fires in the Northern Tablelands RFS region, and 17 of those fires were in the Glen Innes 7 Shire area, and therefore I figured we needed every firebomber we had, and I thought it was pretty much up to me to fix it. So I did. If you go back strolling through my videos, you'll find a movie called Firebird 251, and airframe damage or structural damage detected while uploading water. The next movie is the tape repair, and then there's a movie showing the first takeoff, and then there's a movie showing what it looks like after it's done two flights dropping water on the fires. So we got through the day okay. But my concern is that when operating on a gravel strip, the wheels and the auxiliary ventral fins are so perfectly placed with respect to each other that the same wheel has thrown two stones and hit the same fin in the same place twice. This kind of suggests to me that it's a generic fault with all the air tractors. It means that the designer would have been a lot more sensible in the long run if at least half, if not all, of the auxiliary fin could have been mounted above the level of the stabiliser, thereby making it much less likely that it could be hit by a stone flung up from a wheel. Therefore, thus and because, it is my very strong feeling that it would be a really clever idea if the RFS were to slightly amend their standard operating procedure and require that during the water reloading process, at some point, either the wingman or perhaps the second hose coupler, because while the hose is being used to pump water or retardant onto the aircraft, there's two people who are standing right in there, sort of about here where the connection is, and they're not doing anything. One of them would be sufficient to watch the wingman and act on any relayed command from the pilot out to the wingman, back to the hose connector, and switch off. If the pilot he's getting a cockpit indication that there's busted plumbing or something else is going on, he needs to have the water pipe stop, then okay, that can happen. That would free up the other hose connector to come back here and just scrutinise the tail feathers and make sure that nothing is about to fall off and get stuck in the hinge line. Because if you get anything stuck in the hinge line of that elevator, if it happens on takeoff, he's not going to clear the fence. And if it happens while diving at the fire, at maximum airspeed and maximum power as he tries to pull out, if that's jammed, he's not going to pull out of the dive. Okay, so I might be an autodidactic aeroplanologist, and I may not have ever done the Airbase Operators course with the RFS. 12 years ago I did 3 days on an airbase. Last week I did 2 days on an airbase. But I sort of know a bit about aeroplanes, and I have a track record of being correct. Nobody could put up with a smart ass unless the smart ass is competent, and I try to be a competent smart ass. I've got a little bit of time left on this movie, so I might as well give you a curriculum vitae so you can see whether I'm worth paying attention to on this subject. First time I worked on an airfield, it was Old Barrel Airfield, owned by Neil Cotty. He had 2 tiger moths. He had a hornet moth, and somebody else had a different hornet moth. He had a Piper Cub. He had a Fokker triplane, and when I got there, the Sopwith Pup was under construction. My first day working for Neil Cotty, I was scraping the paint from this tiger moth. Not a bad achievement for 1978 when you haven't left high school, but that's what happened. The original deal was that I was supposed to get a flying lesson for every day that I worked scraping the paint off the tiger moth, but as you can imagine, millionaire international businessmen tend to be too preoccupied to keep up with that. So as payment, this became mine. An 8 horsepower, 2-axis control, single surface wing, Skycraft Scout. And that's what I made my first solo in 1978. These days it hangs in the Inverell Transport Museum, and I jokingly claim that, you know, I'm the last person to fly the world's first legal minimum aircraft, and therefore anybody else should pay a little bit of attention to what I say, because I've actually flown something which was 3 different ways measurably worse than what the Wright brothers had the first time they took off under power. Okay, so I haven't quite been flying since Pontius was a pilot, but when a friend of mine was building a VJ-24, and he got it almost to nearly this stage. In fact, this is what the fuselage looked like when I bought it. I redesigned and rebuilt the leading edge of the wing, and I designed and built the fuselage pod, and I made it look like that, and it flew better too. And yeah, I've even got air-to-air footage of me flying under my own pop rivets. Okay? But that's just a bit of a personal feather in the cap. When it comes down to safety issues, there have been times when I've been known to shake the tree. I crashed in May 1992, and a friend of mine who had an aircraft, an ultralight, which was purpose designed for aero towing hang gliders, he decided to kind of get me back in the saddle, and he gave me the job of standing on the ground with a radio and letting him know, as a tow pilot, when I thought, as a ground observer, that the hang glider he was towing was out of control and about to crash. So by April 1995 we were getting good enough that you know, I was writing articles and posting photos in S.A.A magazine to try and get people to come to Glen Innes and have a holiday, and you know, old mate in his tug would pull them up into the sky and let them loose in a thermal. So yeah, we got good enough at that we wound up with gaggles of hang glider pilots in bunches of a dozen coming up here to the tablelands. That little speck there is actually me standing behind with me radio in my hand. And the deal is the hang glider pilot takes off in harness, in prone, from the trolley, and when standing behind one has a perfect view. And my particular little inspiration was to realise that if the hang glider has got more than 40 degrees of bank and it's on the wrong side of the tow line, then the pilot cannot shift enough weight far enough to change the behaviour of the glider, and he's locked out and he's going to turn upside down, and then he's going to pitch, and then he's going to break the weak link. And unless he's 250 feet above the ground, he's going to punch into the ground very hard and hurt himself or possibly die. Here's a picture of the prototype Moyes Bailey Dragonfly. 36-foot wingspan, 30 degrees permanently drooped full span flapper-ons with a tow pole, and the bridle is harnessed at the top, got a release at the bottom, and therefore one is towing through the axis of the centre of the propeller, so there's no trim change regardless of the load. There's a view taken by the hang glider pilot. Same picture actually I showed you in the C.A.S.A magazine, but 5 years later, and they've done a better job of printing it. And here's the 4-part sketch, which when I couldn't get the industry leader to pay much attention to, I wound up sending this sketch of the lockout index plus the results of 500 aero tows that I'd conducted as safety officer without any legal sanction. I sent it all to the head of C.A.S.A, a fellow called Dick Smith at the time, and I said, look mate, what you've got is a can of worms, because what is not legal is quite safe, and what is legal is actually deadly dangerous, as evidenced by the crash of a fellow called Clinton. And I was standing here while I watched him get towed through a 3-phase pilot-induced oscillation where he was locked out, and then he crashed. And I sent all this off to C.A.S.A. And a few months later, my method was made mandatory industry standard for all aero towing training operations. They didn't adopt the braking parachute on the trolley, but everything else was picked up. Except, of course, that initially it only applied to training operations. So the loophole for anybody who thought they had really big balls was to say that they weren't training, they were experienced, and therefore the next person who was towed off the ground and killed by the same pilot who was flying that day, when as a time expired registered nurse we got to resuscitate Quentin and he lived for 3 days. The next time this pilot killed somebody, it was the president of the hang gliding club, because he was experienced. And since then, you want to tow hang gliders in Australia? Then congratulations, you get to tow them my way. And that way, they don't get to crash halfway down the runway. Far as I know, since 1997, that little trick, the lockout index, has been saving 10 takeoff crashes a year, which is 1 fatal, 2 high quads, 3 paraplegics in wheelchairs, and 4 cashed up yuppies who are unfit to work for a couple of years. That's pretty much why the grateful nation of Australia is fairly happy to pay me a disability support pension, because I'm a Fruit Loop who should be isolated, sat on a hill under a gum tree talking to the kangaroos until I come up with something else that's important. Another thing that I succeeded in doing was cut the price of second-hand thrusters from about $13,000 to $15,000 down to about $3,000. And that's what a thruster looks like. There's another one, $14,000, $11,500. But what I did in November 2000 was I sent a letter to the editor of the Australian Ultralight Federation's monthly magazine. The AUF is the governing authorising body, or it was at the time. Once upon a time it was legal to make and sell little twiddly flying machines (minimum aircraft) after the Wheeler Scout and Air Navigation Order 95.10. The thruster was a second generation aircraft. The early thruster was designed to look faster than its rivals, to distance itself from the stereotypical tail-down mushy way that Scouts wallowed around the sky. In the absence of power sufficiently to actually go fast, the early thrusters were rigged with a high angle of attack on the wing, so the wing could fly slowly at its happy angle while the fuselage hung at a nose-down, faster-looking attitude. If wing geometry was like conventional tail draggers, this wouldn't be a hassle, but sometimes when autodidacts design flying machines, well understood principles are overlooked in honest ignorance. The thruster stalls its wing before its tail is low enough to reach the ground because of its look-fast wing incidence. So if treated like any conventional tail dragger, it falls out of the sky and bounces all over the paddock. And that was just my opening thrust. I kept going for the whole article. And apparently the price of a second-hand thruster crashed to below $3,000 because nobody wanted to fly them. Now what was the reaction of the governing body? Thrusteroid Thinking, Australian Ultralight Federation, 22 November. Dear Christopher, carefully avoiding any AU articles which have a heading which suggests the old flying cowpat, I had also missed the author until all the thrusternauts started tearing their shirts in public on the AUF chat line. I have a vague idea we established some time ago that you weren't on the WWW, so you are blissfully unaware of the crying and gnashing of teeth that you have set loose in the camp of the thrusteroids. Yay team, with a typewriter and snail mail, I crashed their website. The purpose of this letter is to thank you for the article. Not only was it well written and humorous, it was also spot on facts-wise. Here's an additional bit for you. According to who rang today, when the Brits did their certification of the thruster, they found that the aerofoil didn't produce the required lift for certification, and the only way they could get it through was to fit aerofoil lift struts. Do you like that? Anyway, like a true coward, I won't be publishing this letter. However, both Rod and myself gave you a rousing cheer. Keep it up. And I'm sure that a sufficient distance of time has passed that Mido will not get too upset with me for revealing that communication on AUF official letterhead. So there you go. I have form on safety issues. I am a competent smartass, otherwise nobody would put up with me. I have a long history of being just about right all of the time. Maybe just about right just about all of the time. In this matter of the auxiliary ventral fins on the air tractors and their vulnerability to stone damage and the current airbase operations procedures for the RFS, I'm right again. I'm so right I'm not going to wait for the paperwork to go up and back down the channel because we're in a fire season right now. And I would like it if all pilots of all air tractors involved in firefighting operations would personally ask their RFS refilling crew to do a visual inspection of the tail feathers before sending them out on the next flight. Boggles the outlaw aeroplanologist strikes again, aka warbles on a lot, has his mouth open and flapping. Still, can't drink that, gotta take the top off. Much more betterer. Ciao.